Hollywood liked to believe it understood power. Money, contracts, influence, fear, those were the currencies that had always worked. They decided who spoke, who stayed, who disappeared. Men who controlled those things rarely questioned their reach. Until they met Marlon Brando. By the time the night unfolded, Brando was already considered dangerous, not because he was violent or unpredictable, but because he was unmoved. He didn't flatter powerful men. He didn't bend his posture when money entered the room. He carried himself as if approval were optional, and that unsettled people who relied on it for authority. The event itself was supposed to be harmless. A charity function in Los Angeles, hosted at a large ballroom attached to a luxury hotel. Studio executives, producers, performers, and a handful of men whose names never appeared on invitations but always found their way inside. The kind of night built on polite smiles and unspoken hierarchies. Brando attended reluctantly. He stood near the edge of the room, drink untouched, watching the theater of it all, the handshakes, the laughter that came a second too late, the way certain men cleared space simply by entering it. He wasn't impressed. He never had been. That was what drew attention to him. Across the room stood a mob-connected figure from the East Coast, a man used to being deferred to without explanation. He wore his confidence openly like a badge, surrounded by associates who laughed when he laughed and watched the room when he didn't. He noticed Brando almost immediately. Not because Brando was loud, but because he wasn't. Men like that sensed resistance instinctively. Silence that didn't seek permission felt like disrespect. The mob figure excused himself from his group and crossed the room with casual entitlement, stopping a few feet from Brando. "So this is him," the man said, voice smooth, just loud enough to be overheard. "The actor who doesn't play along." Brando looked at him, expression neutral. "Depends on the game." A few heads turned. The mob figure smiled. "Funny. You think you're above it." "I think I know when I'm being tested," Brando replied. The smile tightened. Conversation nearby slowed. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't comfortable. The man was used to people retreating at the first hint of confrontation. Brando stood still, hands relaxed, eyes steady. "You know who I am?" the man asked. "I know what you want me to think," Brando said. That answer landed wrong. The mob figure laughed once, sharp. "Careful," he said. "Places like this run on cooperation." Brando nodded. "So do illusions." The word hung between them. People began to notice. A studio executive tried to interject, offering introductions, softening the moment. The mob figure waved him off without looking. "This charity thing," the man continued, gesturing around the room. "It's all for show. You know that, right? Everyone here's pretending to be respectable for one night." Brando didn't respond. The man leaned closer. "And then there's you, standing there like you don't owe anyone a damn thing." "I don't," Brando said quietly. The temperature shifted. A few feet away, someone whispered that this wasn't going to end well. Another man glanced toward the exits. Nobody intervened. They were waiting to see who blinked first. The mob figure straightened, his voice lowering. "You should learn how things work before you offend the wrong people." Brando met his gaze. "You should learn the same." The insult wasn't in the words. It was in the calm. That was when the man decided to escalate. Not with violence but with authority. "You're done here," he said, loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "I don't want you in this room." The silence was immediate. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't posturing. It was a public attempt to assert control, to remind everyone watching who had the power to include and exclude. Brando didn't move. "I wasn't invited by you," he said. "So you don't get to dismiss me." The mob figure's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you to leave." "No Brando replied. One word. No heat. No theatrics." Executives froze. This was the moment they feared, the one where things became uncontrollable. The mob figure had expected resistance to look like fear or anger. What he got instead was refusal. "You think this ends well for you?" the man asked. Brando glanced around the room. At the men pretending not to watch. At the people who wanted him gone simply so the tension would disappear. Then he looked back at the mob figure. "I think this ends the moment you realize you don't control me," he said. The mob figure laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. You really think you're untouchable? I think you're overestimating your reach, Brando answered. A murmur rippled through the room. This was no longer about Brando. It was about precedent. About whether intimidation still worked the way it used to. About whether one man could draw a line without backing down. The mob figure took a step closer. His associates shifted behind him. You're making a mistake, he said. Brando didn't step back. I've already decided what I'm willing to lose. That sentence landed heavier than any threat. Because it revealed something dangerous. Brando wasn't bargaining. He wasn't calculating risk in the way everyone else was. He'd already accepted the consequences, and that robbed the mob figure of leverage. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The room waited. And in that waiting, something subtle began to change. People started to understand that this wasn't a fight that could be won with force or humiliation. The mob figure could cause trouble, yes, but only by escalating in a way that would expose him, not Brando. The mob figure seemed to realize it too. His expression hardened, then smoothed. He looked around the room, aware of the eyes on him, of the attention he hadn't planned for. This isn't over, he said quietly. Brando nodded once. I know. Then Brando did something unexpected. He turned away. Not retreating. Not fleeing. Simply disengaging. Walking toward another part of the room as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. The mob figure stood there, momentarily stranded in the aftermath of his own threat. The charity event continued. Music resumed. Conversations restarted, forced and fragile. But something had shifted. A line had been tested, and it hadn't moved. Brando spent the rest of the evening speaking with a few friends, then left early. No one stopped him. No one challenged him again. But everyone remembered. Because the man who was supposed to stay quiet hadn't. And the man who expected control had been denied it. Publicly, calmly, and without spectacle. What followed would prove whether that moment was just an anomaly, or the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. The days after the charity event passed without incident. No warnings. No phone calls. No quiet messages delivered through intermediaries. That absence spoke louder than any threat. Hollywood had expected fallout. Rumor circulated that Brando would be frozen out, that studio doors would close, that a lesson would be taught discreetly and efficiently. That was how power usually reasserted itself. Slowly and visibly, until resistance learned its place. But nothing happened. Marlon Brando noticed the silence and understood it for what it was. Calculation. Men who lived by intimidation knew when escalation would cost more than retreat. The mob figure hadn't lost control that night, but he hadn't gained it either. And in a room full of witnesses, that mattered. Brando went back to work. He always did. He showed up to rehearsals. He studied scripts. He argued over lines when they felt false and stayed quiet when they felt true. He didn't posture or mention the incident. He didn't try to turn it into legend. Hollywood did that for him. The story spread in fragments. No one told it the same way twice, but the core never changed. A powerful man tried to assert dominance, and Brando refused to acknowledge it. Calmly, publicly, without consequence. Executives whispered about it in offices with closed doors. Not in outrage, but in confusion. He didn't back down, one said. And nothing happened to him, another replied. That second part unsettled them most. The mob figure heard the versions too. Back east, the story traveled differently. Stripped of glamour. Reduced to essentials. It wasn't about a charity event or a movie star. It was about a man who didn't respond the way men were supposed to. No anger. No fear. No bargaining. Just refusal. The mob figure understood reputation better than most. He knew that intimidation only worked when others believed in it. And that night in that room, belief had wavered. Escalating now, weeks later, would only confirm something he didn't want confirmed. That he tried to exert control and failed. That a Hollywood actor had forced him to stop without raising his voice. So he let it stand. That decision traveled quietly too. Back in Los Angeles, people began adjusting around Brando. Not with admiration. Hollywood rarely admired what it couldn't control, but with caution. Jokes stayed measured. Invitations came with more respect. Conversations avoided certain lines altogether. It wasn't fear. It was acknowledgement. Brando noticed it, but he didn't indulge it. He didn't lean into the mystique or cultivate it. He remained exactly as he'd been before. Direct, uncompromising, uninterested in power games. That consistency was what solidified everything. If he'd boasted, the moment would have shrunk. If he dramatized, it would have become rumor. But because he treated it as finished business, everyone else did too. Months later, Brando crossed paths with one of the executives who'd been at the charity event. The man looked older, more careful. "I thought you were reckless that night," the executive admitted quietly. Brando didn't react. "I wasn't reckless." "What were you then?" "Clear," Brando said. The executive nodded slowly. "You could have made things easier for yourself." "Yes," Brando agreed. "And harder to live with." That answer stayed with the executive long after the conversation ended. The industry liked to frame moments like that as bravery. Brando never did. He didn't see himself as courageous. Courage implied a decision to confront danger. To him, it had been simpler. He'd been unwilling to accept humiliation as a cost of doing business. That refusal shaped everything that came after. Younger actors watched closely. They didn't talk about the mob figure or the threat. They talked about the refusal. About how Brando hadn't tried to win the room. He'd simply declined to be ruled by it. They began asking different questions in meetings. They negotiated instead of pleading. They walked away from roles that demanded obedience instead of honesty. Not all of them succeeded. But the idea had been planted. Hollywood adapted the only way it ever did, by pretending it had always been this way. By rewriting the narrative to make resistance seem inevitable instead of costly. Brando didn't participate in that rewrite. Years later, when someone asked him whether he ever worried about consequences from powerful men, he answered without drama. "Only when I forgot who I was." That night at the charity event faded into legend not because of what happened next, but because nothing did. No retaliation. No punishment. No quiet destruction. Just an unspoken understanding that something had shifted. A mob figure had tried to control Marlon Brando, and discovered that control required consent. The room that night hadn't exploded. No one had raised a fist. No threats had been carried out. Instead, power had been denied its favorite fuel: fear. And without fear, it had nowhere to go. That was the ending. Not dramatic. Not violent.